Good afternoon. We're here to continue our discussion from this morning, and this afternoon's panel is the Community Perspective and Solutions. And we are going to be discussing the historical and systemic issues associated with crime and the response of police to those communities most affected by crime. I will first go to introducing my panel here. Again, we have Dansky, Senior Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. Kara, thank you so much for coming back again this afternoon. We have Ron Hampton. Mr. Hampton is the D.C. representative for Blacks in Law Enforcement of America. Welcome, Ron, this afternoon to our panel. And Lamont Carey, who is the founder and CEO of LaCarey Enterprises, LLC. And Lamont, thank you again for coming this afternoon. I think I'm going to start with Lamont. We had an opportunity at the break to get into a very spirited discussion from this morning's discussion and kind of a lot of the issues that came up. But I'm going to start with you and ask you, when you were growing up in your own community, and please tell us what that community was,
okay.
What did policing look like to you?
Well, I grew up in Southeast Washington, D.C., and I had a real distrust for police officers, mainly because every time they came, they took somebody away that I loved or that I knew, or they brutalized them in some form or fashion. And so I was always skeptical, fearful. Only good experience I ever had with police officers, they used to have a side-by-side band that used to come to my elementary school. And so I think I grew up fearful of them. So yeah, that was mainly it. I ran from the police even when I wasn't guilty. At first I used to walk away, and that's because they used to stop us for just being outside. So let me say this. From my perspective, the people in my community, African Americans in my community, seem to be very trusting at times, can be gullible at times, but overall seem like very trusting that justice will be served, even though statistics or even just from the outlook of our community, we have never actually experienced justice. Like I don't know one person from my community that feel that they have really experienced justice. And so my outlook on the police growing up, perceived them as a threat to my well-being and to the people that I live amongst in my community.
Lamont, the people that are listening to this webinar can't see you, and just so the listeners know, it's obviously sometimes painful for you to think back on this and talk about this, but we're here with you, and we want to make sure you feel like you can be brutally honest with us. Well, so don't hold back. Is
okay,
what I
got
say.
some more to give you then. My other experience with the police is that as a teenager, I don't know how many times that I've been robbed by undercover, what we used to call jump out police officers in our community. They will jump out they'll be in plain clothes and just regular cars, and they'll jump out on us, they'll check us, and so many times they'll say, where's a pay stub or a receipt for this money? And they'll just take my money. And so that is what I know of the policing. But when the public, how the media portray us as like that we are a threat, I don't know one black person, at least from my community or on a whole, that has ever declared war against the police department where they would need of tanks and all these military weapons. For anything, we have been like more control. Many of the individuals, I once was in the street life as a criminal drug dealer, But most of the guys that I knew in that lifestyle never targeted police. They never targeted like other racial communities, but we are deemed some vicious group of people, blanket as vicious group of people. And so that is my perception of how I saw the police when I was growing up. That I could be killed, I could be hurt, I could be kidnapped and arrested for anything or anytime if they feel or don't like me. And another thing that I'm gonna shut up is that I knew very little of my rights as a citizen of the United States, but as an adult, as I learned more about my individual rights with the police department, I learned from growing up and as an adult that there are times you can exercise those rights. So if I'm pulled over for some kind of traffic violation, whatever they deem the reasons for pulling me over, I know in a well-lit street with people moving about that I can exercise my rights as an individual. But if I'm pulled on a dark street or dimly lit street or in any park area and anywhere in this country, I don't feel safe that I can exercise my right, because that can be perceived as being a hothead or something that's going to only escalate the situation. So growing up, I was extremely fearful of the police, and even as an adult, I have some hesitations with them. So that's my...
Lamont, I'm going to ask you, because those of us who didn't grow up in D.C., when you describe your community and your neighborhood, could you tell the audience what are the demographics? What kind of community are you talking about?
Where the communities that I grew up in, majority was probably 99% African Americans, impoverished communities, and so that's basically the makeup.
And do you think that community policing, what was going on generally across Washington, D.C. and Maryland, or do you think your particular neighborhoods and neighborhoods like them were being over-policed, and why?
Well, I guess they were over-policed because I always see a police officer. The nicest police officer I ever seen is the ones that be on the bike. They seem to be friendly. I guess because they can't get away fast or something. I don't know. But I think when as an adult, and I speak or have an opportunity to experience more communities like mine of predominantly African Americans, they seem to have the same fear or hesitation as it relates to police and whether we're overly policed or what have you. But the one thing that I don't understand is for me to see so many police in my community, it was always like they were reactive. They were never there to prevent the crimes, like the murders, the attempted murders, but outside, they're always coming after that. So I don't know where they are when those things are actually taking place. So in a sense, our communities are definitely way over police, but they are never there when they are really needed by individuals in my community.
You told us a little bit about having a run-in with law enforcement and being involved in the criminal justice system, and I want to ask you about when you got in trouble as a juvenile. Did anyone try to intervene and divert you from the criminal justice system when you got your first offense, or from there on? Did you have any support system?
No. You would have people like uncles or something say, man, you can't be living like that. But that as far as that conversation went, it was no one there that would actively try to convince me to go in another direction. But one of the things that I learned from my community is that my community was mainly comprised of people that felt powerless. So I'm not a history buff, but I just know that my community feel powerless, and it seems that we have always felt powerless So when people say, like, we always claim to be victims, but when you kidnapped and taken somewhere, I think it's sort of some kind of justification to feeling like victims, and so I think whatever would continue to, for my family and the people in my community to feel victimized was that if you look at the 1960s, the images of police, dogs being put on our people or being sprayed with water hoses, and then you even look at like our living situations. From my understanding, like people would say that my community, that fathers don't want to be involved, but I remember growing up that my father couldn't live with my mother, or she wouldn't be able to have the subsidized housing that she was in. And so all of those kind of things shaped like my perception on life. It didn't even include like education, how I used to be told that I go all the way through school, I'm still gonna not know how to read, or why go all the way through school and you still won't be able to afford to go college. So the people in my community were helpless or felt helpless, and so as a kid, all of their fears became my fears, and that made me initially fearful of everything, white people, police, and so because then the police kind of infused that by every interaction that I seen with them with somebody in my community, it was always the bad outcome for people in my community.
You've given us a little bit about the backdrop of how you felt, but obviously you've become successful. And so what clicked, what changed in your life to put you on a different path?
Well, I think what really changed is that I learned to think for myself more, and today I don't live like under or trying to reach or work inside of the system, because if I worked in trying to survive inside of the system, meaning the laws of just the United States or what I'm supposed to be able to do, I'm supposed to be in prison right now. Because if you look at, I'm a felon, I'm a convicted felon, so I don't qualify for a whole range of jobs. And even in some like small retail places, I don't even qualify to work there. Some housing communities I can't even live in because I'm a convicted felon. So what would enable me to, one, successfully transition from prison, and one, to be able to gain some form of success that people deem me as being successful, is that I don't look for the government to tell me what I can do. So it's almost like I had to create my own route on how I'm gonna be successful. So for me, entrepreneurship was the route that I had to take. If not, then I would be living in a homeless shelter. I've been in a homeless shelter like 3 times this week doing voter registration. And I will be living in there because I've seen so many African American males who are living in a homeless shelter who have a job but can't afford housing. So if I didn't choose entrepreneurship, I will be either living in a homeless shelter, or I will be in a federal or state prison institution, and that's just my reality if I didn't figure out how to think outside of the box, how to remove myself or be able to overcome those obstacles that are set up or appear to be set up for it to be a dead end for me. And so that is how I think I was able, and plus I'm a good writer. So writing books is one of my streams of income, and motivational speaking is one of my streams of income, and creating plays, directing plays and film projects is how I've been able to avoid being told no when you had to check, have you ever been convicted of a felony? So by me being able to create my own business, and that helped me tremendously, because now I get hired to speak or do trainings for staff at places that I legally or by their policies I couldn't even work at. So because of my past, if I try to succeed within the system, it says I'm not worthy enough, that I'm not qualified enough. But as an entrepreneur, that people are able to see that I have value, that I have worth. And the strange thing about it is that the things that I'm using to be successful now were the same skill sets I had as a criminal. I was just able to use some of those things learned from the street as transferable skills. Like as a criminal or as a drug dealer, I learned customer service. I learned supply and demand. I learned packaging. So it was a slew of skills that I was able to transfer over into something productive, something positive. But if I didn't do it as an entrepreneur, the general world or employment route would have never been able to experience the gifts and talents that I could bring to the table, because they eliminate me before they have an opportunity to really experience me.
We're all smiling at that translation from drug dealer to successful businessman,
Right.
And those skills, but it rings true for us. And I guess for us, what we're wondering is, what do you tell the felon coming out of prison who doesn't have that special set of skills, who's the regular guy or gal out there who is reentering and they don't have that special set of skills that you might have?
The one thing that I would tell them, your first priority is not making sure your family is all right. None of that. Your first priority should be making sure your relationship with your parole officer is good. Because the thing that I learned from being on parole is that the parole officer can restrict me from so many things, or they can allow me to accomplish other things. Like, for instance, by having a good relationship with your parole officer, when resources come across your parole officer desk, they're not looking to give them to the knuckleheads. They're looking for the clients who they believe is trying to do something with themselves. So, and if you end up having a situation where you're arrested for something, your parole officer can either come to court and say, well, Lamont Carey was doing so well, this just was a hiccup, I think he should be released. Or they can go in and say, he's been a problem on my caseload for such and such time, I think he's a danger to society, so I want you to hold him. So for me, the first priority is making sure you have a good relationship with your parole officer. The second thing, those dreams that they had in prison, that's what you pursue. Because one of the things I was told in prison is that I have to forget people, places, and things. And that made me feel helpless, because it told me that I didn't have anything to offer. And so most of the interactions, even now with me interacting with prisoners getting ready to come home or after they're released, they seem helpless. They seem at the mercy of me, as if they have nothing to offer. But every individual that I was in prison with had a dream. There was something that they was going to do when they came home. Fitness trainer, some kind of marketing guru. Some of them even wanted to be strippers. So my point is, what was it helped me to overcome the obstacles that were in front of me is that I stayed true to those plans that I created when I was in prison. And you can't allow nobody else to place limitations on you or pour their fears into you and cause that to prevent you from accomplishing what you want to accomplish. Because the one thing that I've learned from personal experience, that I can have anything that I desire, as long as that I don't give up on it and I'm determined to accomplish it. So I'm not unique. I'm not the smartest prisoner. I'm not the dumbest prisoner. but I am the most determined person that I'm going to have anything that I want, and I can't be denied. And what gives me that power is that I have already been in the worst conditions. I've already lived in poverty majority of my life. I've already lived in prison for 11 years of my life. The only thing left is death, and I'm not afraid of that. So somebody telling you no is small compared to if you keep pushing through doors, you're going to get some yeses. So that's what I would tell somebody that's coming home from prison. The only limitations that you have are the ones that you believe in. And so that's what I would tell them.
Lastly, Lamont, I'm going to ask you, because I think the discussion of race is going to come up this afternoon in our discussions as well, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about whether or not you think race played a part in your going to prison in the first place, or the obstacles you've had to overcome in reentry.
Of course, I believe that race plays a part in everything, and I mean in connection to my community. But the decision that I made to become a drug dealer wasn't solely based on race. It was based on, then again, it was because I was told, this is what I was told growing up, that the white man wasn't going to allow me to be nothing. And I was told by not just one individual, but a community of people. I mean, you can see it in their eyes when they come and they say, you know, I went to try to get a job, I couldn't get a job, or I couldn't do this, or I couldn't do that. So I believe race plays a part in how my community is perceived, how my community responds. But the biggest thing is that the individuals in my community have to say that I'm not going to allow that to dictate who I am, what I become, what I can achieve. So, yes, race plays a part, but I think we can take back, well, we can have a power that we have never recognized before when we start looking at each other, how to uplift each other and protect each other versus waiting on this system who has continually failed us. But we also have to become a part of that system. We have to encourage our children to run for office, to become police officers, to vote. Like in so many states that where ex-offenders aren't allowed to vote, but our family members can help us get that power. So, in my opinion, I think we have to almost mentally become almost like a state within ourselves, or a country within ourselves. We have to build up ourselves versus distancing ourselves from each other. Like earlier when we were off here, we had a conversation about African Americans looking at other African Americans like, I succeeded, how can you not succeed? It's just like we're always trying to fit in and be embraced by Europeans versus, and so when we're trying, it seems to me like when we're trying to be embraced, that the best way for us, it seems, to be embraced is like we have to distance ourselves from each other, and that causes more harm than it does helping us, because soon something goes wrong with someone that seems to figure they better than us, they come to our community to support us. But we can accomplish so much as a people or as citizens of this country if we lift each other up. I mean, from those individuals that I talked about that's living in a shelter, who's working, who can't afford housing. Laws. If we go to the ballot boxes and we stand behind individuals who have our best interests at heart, then we can, that is one way that we can help change those situations. But as a people, those of us that are successful, we start investing in our communities, then we can hire the people from our communities and all of those ways that strengthen our communities, and that lessens the power that racism has over us, because now we is like, it seems like we're looking to fit into or be accepted by other races, and that is what seems like we feel makes us successful, but that is not what makes us successful. What makes us successful is being my brother's keeper. And so that's my issue. I mean, how I see dealing with the issues that we face and with race, because I have no problem with no one of color, I mean, of any other race. I just know in order for me, for my legacy to be anything good, I have to make sure my son, my neighbor's son, and all of those have the best opportunities that they could possibly have. And the only way I can really see those opportunities being handed to them is that we have to groom them in order to fill those roles that we have created. So I know I was long-winded, but
No,
I'm emotional.
thank you very much, please. And so I'm going to go to you, Ron, because it's kind of a perfect segue here in terms of, Lamont's talking about telling our children to be the doctors, the lawyers, the policemen, and you were the policeman. So I want to talk to you about being a policeman on the beat here in Washington, D.C., and what was community policing when you were on the beat.
Well, thank you. Yes, I was a police officer, and I was a different kind of police officer because I came to policing very different. I didn't want to be a police officer in the beginning. When I came back from Vietnam, finished my service time, I did a variety of things. And then, as a matter of fact, how I even came to policing was I used to work for the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. And my job was I would open the mail, read the mail, read the request for information, and then go to the data banks and all that and draw the information out, read it, and then I would summarize it and send it to the individual who requested it. So I was reading about the Kansas City patrol experiment. I was reading about a variety of research studies that had gone on in policing in the early 70s. I mean, in the very early 70s, and then in the late 60s, and the Colonel report after the '68 riots. I was reading all that, so I said, well, policing may be the thing. Being a police officer may enable me to really be involved in some change. And then plus I had some old racial experiences when I was in Japan and in Vietnam, and I was very much aware of all of that, and then through the riots too. So when I came home, I worked on Capitol Hill for a minute, and in the Criminal Justice Reference Service I was there for about a year, and so I joined the police department. And to my surprise, the police department wasn't nothing like what I was reading about at the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. It really wasn't. That wasn't traditional policing. Traditional policing was going out, locking up people, law and order, and all those kind of things. And then at that particular time, coming out of the riots, even though there was a little bit of experimentation going on in policing, it was really very traditional. But I had made up my mind that I was going to be the kind of police officer that I wanted to be, the kind of police officer that I thought my community needed also, because I was very much aware of those needs and the desires of the people. So from the very beginning, I was assigned to the 3rd District in Northwest, and I walked the foot beat for the first 3 years on U Street, as a matter of fact, from 7 to 15, from V Street to S. And that was right in the middle in those days of the Black Mecca. That's what U Street was. And so I remember my mother bringing me to U Street, going to the Lincoln Theater, the Howard Theater, and all those kind of things. And I knew some of those guys too, because I played sports in the city who lived and worked in that area. So my policing was very good. Experience was very good. But that wasn't community policing, not in the early 70s. Community policing as a paradigm didn't come around to like the mid-'80s. 84, 85 was when Genovich and all of them started talking about community policing and had a variety of forums all over the country, and we attended those forums and talked about community policing. And I was excited about community policing because it wasn't just something that we did every day on the outside of the police department in terms of an external strategy. It was an internal strategy that facilitated an external strategy. And in order for it to be successful, the most important component of it was it had to have community input, because it was called community policing. It wasn't called policing the community. It was called community policing. Very few police departments got involved in that. It took place later on. And I want to just go back for a minute and separate out traditional policing from community policing. There's a component in traditional policing, for example, for history buffs, may not know that African American police officers were not allowed to work with white police officers until after 1969, or in late 1969, when they integrated police cars in this city and a lot of other cities. There were guys on the police force prior to me that walked the footbeat because they could only walk a footbeat. They couldn't ride in cars and they couldn't have white partners. And so in 1969, when they desegregated police cars, then blacks and whites rode together and walked footbeats together. And so racism was a part of policing. I mean, before 1961, black police officers couldn't even arrest white people in this country. And there, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there were actually black police departments established inside of police departments to police black communities in places like New Orleans and Dallas and other cities. So the whole history of race, the whole history of policing has a race component to it. And it also has a female component to it, because women were not allowed to be police officers. In police departments, there was actually a position called policewoman, and women had to have a degree to be in policing, and most of the time they were relegated to working with youth and women, and not working on the street or riding with men, and doing those kind of duties. They were also not allowed to wear pants; they could only wear skirts. So there's the whole history, and it's interesting that sometimes we should pay attention to the history, because the history is also has laid out the present and the future of policing to some extent in terms of how we go about doing it. So community policing wasn't around in that time, and to our credit, to some extent, people like Bertel Jefferson, the first black chief of police in the city, and Maurice Turner and Ike Fullwood, there were examples of community policing, because I walked a footbeat. I didn't have a car, but in order for my footbeat to be successful, I had to know the people on my footbeat. I can tell you that there were 5,100 people that lived on my footbeat in Adams Morgan. I can tell you how many fire hydrants was on my footbeat. I can tell you how many grocery stores was on my footbeat, because I needed to learn my footbeat in order to facilitate public safety. And then I got people involved in that process because I lived on my footbeat. Now this is when I first started out, I worked on U Street for 3 years, but then I moved to Adams Morgan. And when I moved to Adams Morgan and walked in Adams Morgan, I also lived in Adams Morgan on Columbia Road. So I was very familiar with it because I lived there. And to me, living in the city, living in your footbeat and being involved in the community you work in I thought it was an asset, and it proved to be an asset. That the people in that community knew I was a police officer. I didn't hide that. I walked to work with my uniform on every morning or whenever I went to work. And the people in my neighborhood knew it wasn't dangerous, it wasn't anything. But it facilitated me being able to do my job in a very effective kind of way. So,
Ron, can you tell us what the years were when you're talking about, so we have context there?
Well, from about 71 to 74, I walked the footbeat on U Street after I got out the academy, and I was out for about, I think, almost 6 months, and then I walked on U Street. And then after 3 years on U Street, I got transferred to Adams Morgan. When I was in Adams Morgan, I worked 16th Street to 18th, Calorama to Harvard. And I walked that foot beat for about 7 years, and then I got transferred and accepted to be an officer friendly, and I worked with the side-by-side band. So when Lamont talked about the side-by-side, I'm very familiar with that. Not that I was in the band, but I was an officer friendly, and it was a very successful, very intimate program. I mean, I still see grown people now that were students when I was an officer friendly who still call me officer friendly, and I've been retired over 20 years.
Tell those of us who aren't familiar with this side-by-side, what exactly was that program?
The officer friendly program was the beginning of putting police officers in schools, not assigning them to individual schools, but officer friendly's job was to go around to different schools, give programs like red light, green light, officer friendly programs. We talked about safety. We talked about street law. We taught street law because after Georgetown had developed the street law program, we actually conducted street law in the schools. And I had 3 schools that I was officer friendly with. I had a high school and I had two elementary schools. I had Cadoza, Harrison Elementary, and also my elementary. And we went around to the different schools. The band was created later, where the bands would also go to the school and pull on performances, and the kids would actually come to the auditorium and dance and have a good time. And it created those relationships that lasted a long time. Mm-hmm. The officer friendly program was also connected to the safety patrol program, and so we would take kids to camp every summer, and it enabled us to build these relationships not only with the students but actually with the families, and these were lasting relationships. And then the officer friendly program sort of was de-emphasized and did away with, and then all of a sudden we saw DARE officers being created because the drug war was being started, and they created this position of DARE officers, so officers could go in schools and talk about don't use drugs or say no to drugs, because that was crazy. I mean, that didn't work, and the research showed that DARE didn't work. And so now we've replaced DARE with resource officers, which isn't working either, because we wasn't assigned to schools, and we were working with schools. Resource officers work in schools. This actually have officers assigned to schools. And principals have a tendency to use police officers rather in situations where they should be handled administratively rather than criminally, because that's one of the components of the school to prison pipeline, where we criminalize young people for infractions that really should be administrative rather than criminal. But that was sort of the history of how all of that started and where we are now.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, I think if you were to talk to kids now about officer friendly, it sounds like something out of a Simpsons show. I mean, it's not, it's not their reality at all. But it sounds so incredibly productive. So maybe someone out there listening, maybe we can get officer friendly back. I think it'd be great. Did you sense that there was racial bias when you were on the force, and on your beat? And I mean, look, it's a little shocking. Maybe other people know that. I had no idea that, that black police officers couldn't have units. I mean, that they had to be on foot. That's incredible. That's shocking to me.
Well, when you relate that to, when you compare that to rather the fact that blacks and whites couldn't eat together.
Right.
When you compare that to black and white couldn't go to the same store together, then the government wasn't the same either.
Right.
For example, black firefighters couldn't stay with white firefighters. Most fire stations had what they called a one black bed, and that's where the black firefighter stayed. And he worked most of the midnight shift. He didn't work day shift, and they didn't have women in those days. So policing wasn't different than any other institution in our society. There was racism in that. There were times, I remember in roll call, when white officers who hadn't gotten used to working with black officers used the N-word. But I can tell you that when they used the N-word, they got knocked in the floor. And so they didn't use it anymore, nor did anybody else on that shift use it again, because it was met with a response. There were times when I was involved in reporting officers for racial comments, and it was very open. And not only they didn't, some of them, in 1969, I remember later when Ike Ford was the chief, he would tell the story about when in 1969 he was a police officer working in the 9th Precinct, which used to be at 9th and 8th Street Northeast rather. And this was about the second day of the week that they had integrated scout cars. And Ike had went to work, they was working evening shift, and they called his name and his partner's name, and so when he got upstairs out of roll call, he was sitting in the station waiting for his partner to come in. His partner never came in, so he went to the station clerk and said, well, where is so-and-so? And said, he checked off and went home because he wasn't going to work with you. And so, you know, they parked the car and Ike walked a foot beat. So, you know, racism has always been, race and racism has always been a part of policing as long as I've been there. And so it's been very, it's also been a very upfront kind of issue sometimes. And in my career,
in D.C.,
in Washington D.C.,
right?
Well,
I think it's different around the country. So.
Right, but in my very early in my career, in 1973, in my career, I joined the National Black Police Associations and was involved with all of these other organizations nationally, addressing issues of race and racism and police brutality and all of that. And as much as race was an issue here in Washington, it was an issue everywhere else, because we had members in our organization that was from all over the country, and they were having the same experiences. And what I liked about the organization is that it was established to look at issues that impact African American police officers, but more importantly, it was also looking at issues that impacted our community that were race based. And so we knew that policing was different in the black community than it was in the white community. That it was black folk were getting arrested for things that white folk would have never got arrested for. I remember I had been on about the first year of my career, and I was riding with a white officer who we was working on U Street, and we were sitting at 14th and U facing 13th Street, and this black guy driving a Mercedes turned the corner and was heading south on 14th Street. So my partner turned the corner and he said, you see that guy in that Mercedes? I said, yeah. He said, I'm gonna pull him over. So I said, for what? So he said, he's driving a Mercedes. So I said, well, what does that mean? And so he pulled him over. And he went up there and talked to him. I got out the car and stood there. And so he asked him for his permanent registration. And he came back to the car. And when he came back to the car, we got in the car and the guy pulled off. So I said, well, what did you find out? He said that, you know, the guy was, he just had a Mercedes and, you know, it was his name was on the registration. And I said, well, what did you think? But I said, I know you thought that a black man driving a Mercedes, you know, shouldn't happen, you know. And so that was regular. That was the regular kind of stuff that was happening. And so, you know, racism was an issue. Race was an issue. And it wasn't denying it. And they didn't deny it either because it was hard. In my opinion, it was hard for them to make that transition. It was just like when we got the first women. I remember when the first women came to our district to walk with us. It was very difficult for these guys to accept that women could be police officers like them. And yet women brought a very unique component to policing, something that, you know, men police officers really didn't have, sometimes couldn't find even if they did have it. But women brought a unique component to policing, and it was needed at that time. But they was very slow and resistant to women being a part of that, as whites were to blacks being there.
Well, let me bring you to present day, and your police chief here in D.C., Chief Lanier, says that they don't do what they call this hotspot policing, or concentrating on certain neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if that's been your observations now as an ex-police officer.
No, I don't agree with that, because I see they may not call it hotspot policing, they may not call it zero tolerance, but jump outs is a form of hotspot policing. And and zero tolerance, because you only do it in certain places, and they go to the high crime. They go to the high crime areas to do that. They don't do it. They don't do it in Georgetown. They don't do it in the upper part of Georgia Avenue, but they'll do it around Georgia and Lamont, Georgia and Otis. You know, those are so-called drug areas. They'll do it in Southeast and Condon Terrace or Southeast on Martin Luther King, because those are so-called drug areas, and they look at information, crime information, to sort of drive where they're going to do it. So if you don't call, if that's not hotspot policing, then I don't know what is. And certainly the use of jump outs is called, to me, is another form of zero tolerance.
And explain to our listeners what jump out is.
Guys who work in plain clothes, casual clothes, street clothes, they drive unmarked cars, and they usually drive around, and then when they see a concentrate or area that, say, 4 or 5 young black men are standing, and I use that term because if it was 4 white men standing there, they wouldn't jump out the car on them. Well, they actually pull up, park the car, run up on the curb sometime, jump out of the car and spring on them, and then start asking them a whole bunch of questions. So it's stop, question, and frisk. Mm-hmm. And that's what they do. And that's a form, to me, of the same, combination of both hotspot policing as well as zero tolerance.
Let me play devil's advocate, though. You said if these are crime-ridden areas, or statistically we know there's a lot of crime, why wouldn't that be good for the safety of the community?
Because it defeats the purpose of protecting the community.
And why do you say that?
Because it turns people who live in that community off when it comes to the police. I heard Lamont talking, and in his conversation he was talking about how he was turned off by the police based on the public safety strategies that they were utilizing in certain communities. They fight crime. Statistically, when you look at crime in our city, and I've done that a variety of times, certain crime happens all over the city. Some areas of the city, crime is sort of documented by ward along with other areas, but the fact of the matter, there's a even distribution of most crimes in the city. There may be some areas where they may have 1 or 2 more homicides than others by wards, but the fact of the matter is that every ward has its own distribution of crime. But how you protect that community and the public safety strategy that they use is very different in those communities. They wouldn't dare jump out and do hotspot policing in Georgetown. And the reason why they're going to do that, number one, is because the people who live in Georgetown are involved in the development of the public safety strategy. In Southeast Washington and Anacostia, that doesn't take place. But they claim they can use it and justify it out there because there are people who call the police because they want the police to come and get those people off the corner. But most of the time in Southeast, the people standing on the corner aren't the people who are selling drugs, because people very rarely sell drugs out in the open. And even if you live on that block, you can't tell from 1320 that's in the middle of the block that a person standing on the corner a half a block away is smoking a joint or a regular cigarette. We don't have the ability to see that. Now, and you may be able to walk down there and identify that, but that's impossible to do. But the police, I think, would have better success if they included the community in the development of the public safety strategy, because when the community gets a chance to establish norms and values for their community, then most of the time the people who would be involved in criminal activity will pick somewhere else to do it at. But they had to know that that won't be tolerated in this community. And the police not working with the community doesn't get the community doesn't get a chance to establish those norms. Let me tell this. When I worked in the 3rd District, there was Girard Street, Belmont, all those streets, and there was a little marijuana selling and smoking going on up in that area, right? This was between 14th and 15th, right adjacent to Malcolm X Park. There were some senior citizens that lived on those blocks, and every now and then the guys be walking through, they may sit on the step and light up a joint, right? The senior citizens who lived in that block, they would go out on the front porch, get the water hose and then water down the front. And the people who were sitting out there would move on, because they ain't gonna sit on no wet concrete. They were establishing norms and values for that community, for that block. You can't do that on the block. And see, that's a form of social control that the community establishes that will move people on. The police, if you're wise, you can, and they said this yesterday, Ron Davis from the cops office said this yesterday, we can almost, there are laws that provide for us to almost lock people up for anything. But the real question on the table is, should we? Because will the action justify the end and the results that we want? And some things we shouldn't do in communities because it's going to turn communities against us, and we won't be able to complete the very job that we have to do and should do in our communities, because the people won't be on our side. And we need trust. That's the only way. I mean, that's an important component. And that's not happening in the city, even though I think our chief thinks so. And she's, very effective with telling these little stories about situations that happen. And that's good, but politically that's that's an asset for her. But it doesn't mean anything to the people who live in the city and in the communities that really don't have a relationship with the police.
Let's relate it now to the militarization issue and talk about communities and policing themselves and having this own kind of set of values.
Right.
How do you think communities relate to this militarization issue and this whole, coming in with the armored cars and the AK-47s and the military-style guns? I mean, how do you resolve that with the community?
Having been around now, I'm a little younger than dirt. I remember this started after Vietnam, because Gates and them in LA had personnel carriers and tanks and all that kind of stuff, and they would pull it out regularly and go down in the Watts and everywhere and batter, knock down doors. So it's been around for a while. But the advantage to policing is that these police executives can do this and don't have to ask the mayor. They don't, because see, if it's in their budget, they have to justify what they're doing and what they're going to use it for. But when they go to the government to get it through this 1133 program, I guess 1033, 1033 program, it's done off the record and out of the vision of the politicians as well as the people in the city, the residents. And so, they can do that kind of stuff, and their rationale for it is that I'd rather have it and don't use it than need it and don't have it, which is a crazy justification. But the fact of the matter is, what ought to justify it is, in some sense, is are those kind of things happening in your city? Is there a history of this kind of stuff being the utilization for it in our city? Does it make sense to have it? And then even if you don't use it, does it make sense to pull it out, because it's going to turn people off. And it's going to take us back to a time where that kind of equipment was used against certain people in certain communities, and so you have lost everything that you had. My attitude when I was policing was, and I took this from one of the airlines, is that I earned my wings every day. Because it only takes one stupid, ignorant police officer 1 minute to ruin something that you had spent a year building, and that was very true. And so trust is a very tentative thing, and so in order to do it, there's a whole lot of things that you have to do. And I also believe in the notion of what I call building capital. I think police departments ought to be in the business of creating community capital, because the relationship between police and community is like marriage relationships. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. But if you've invested, if you have a relationship, then there are times when it's going to be tested. But if you have some capital, then you can say, well, look, we've been friends all this long time, and we've been doing good things. Don't let this little hiccup change what it is that we've worked for 10, 15 years to build. And then you have to really be paying attention to the community in terms of not only transparency, but their participation in the process. You can't come to me and ask me to forgive you when you don't even talk to me. That you can't ask me to understand when you haven't even talked to me. I don't understand nothing. And then when only time you come to me is when you want me to report somebody for shooting my neighbor. That doesn't work in my head. we need to have a relationship, and it should benefit me as much as it should benefit you, because I'm the customer. I'm the one who utilizes public safety. And unfortunately, most of our police officers don't live in the cities and communities they work in.
Right. Yeah, I think that was definitely a big message here.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you about the body camera. We talked about that this morning, and so much has been said that the police need to have body cameras in the wake of Michael Brown and the Ferguson situation, and really, frankly, the context of the entire contact, the context of the interaction, because we know the internet is viral with clips of interactions, and people are questioning, well, what's the full context? So, talk to us about that.
Well, I think cameras are going to be a good thing for a variety of reasons. They've been good so far for us in terms of documenting these. When I say us, I'm talking about the citizens and the community. For document now, we can say, "I told you so." From the police department standpoint in the city, because the city is involved in it, it's about policies and practices as much as it's about the camera. Because we got to think about, how long do we keep the film, for example. Complaints in this city, you can go to the complaint center and file a complaint up to a year on a police officer. So we know it got to stay around at least for a year. When do you cut the camera on? When do they cut it off? What's inbound? What's out of bound? I'm going to tell you my personal response to it would be, if you were coming to my house to take a burglary report, and so when you got, according to the policy now, that when you get the run, they cut the camera on. So when they come to my house, the camera's still on, they come in my house and take the report. I would ask them to cut the camera off in my house because of such laws like in plain view. Not that I got anything or have anything illegal in my house, but I don't know who's been in my house lately. I don't know who sat on the sofa. Someone might have sat on the sofa and a joint fell out. And so, if it's in plain view, the police can seize the joint and then lock me up for possession of marijuana. Even though I know we have a marijuana decrim bill now.
Or if you live in Colorado or Washington State,
Right.
you need to move.
Yeah, that's right.
You're fine.
Yeah. So I don't know how that's going to work. Surely I surely know too that police officers cut cameras off or move out of the range of the incident that's happening. And we've seen the version that we saw, the woman who was in the burgundy car, they was looking for a black man in the brown car, and she had kids, and all that was on camera. And what amazed me about it was the officer, when someone asked the officer, should he apologize to the woman, he said no, he shouldn't have. He didn't think he should apologize because he was doing his job. No, he wasn't doing his job because he was doing his job. He would have paid attention to the lookout. That would have meant that he was doing his job, but he wasn't doing his job. So I thought an apology was certainly the appropriate thing to do for this woman. So the cameras can be good, but there have to be appropriate policies and practices that's going to go along with the use of the cameras, because if not, the cameras won't mean anything. And then we will be talking about what happened before the camera went on. And that, to me, that may not be relevant, because even if the camera wasn't on, was your behavior on the camera justified based on the incident that was taped? Because I think there's going to be a tightrope walk. There's going to be some questions. But they need it. I mean, the police, they would disagree with me, but I think they brought all this on themselves. I really do. I mean, everything. There's supposed to be certainly policies and practices that operate the police department and the individual behavior. But when we start talking about the other kind of things that now they are rejecting and the add-ons that we've seen, to some extent they've brought this on themselves, with lack of transparency, by not having. I don't talk about bad training anymore, because having been a police officer, I know police officers do exactly what they're trained to do. And I'm not saying that they train police officers to shoot people down, but what they do train police officers to do is to justify their shooting. They have to cover their ass. So that, to me, encourages you to lie rather than tell the truth that it was an accident, or there were situations or extenuating circumstances that caused it to happen, but it was an accident. They don't want to say that. Now they want to make up all of the other reasons that really have led them now into a real area that's going to create a lot of problems. When you could have just said exactly what happened, and it was a misfire or whatever, and then we would move on. Yeah, there might be some discipline, but we wouldn't see the kind of situation and responses from the community that we historically see all the time.
Thank you, Ron. I think probably a lot of people echo my sentiment that you're a breath of fresh air, frankly, that we probably don't hear much from ex-police officers like you, so we appreciate it. I think it leads, though, into Kara. You were nodding your head, and I know you'd like to make some suggestions here in terms of, protocol. We have protocol when we videotape confessions. We have protocol on a lot of things in terms of police activity, and so what are your recommendations, or what do you think can be done in terms of, this militarization issue? And the ACLU recommendations, I should say as well.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me again. I've been listening to the conversation so far and to the conversation this morning, and I was reminded of a story that I learned about that took place in a town called Paragould, Arkansas, about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, when the police announced at a town hall meeting that they were going to be carrying AR-15s on routine patrol in high crime neighborhoods, and that officers were going to be instructed that they should stop anyone, anytime, for any reason or no reason, and arrest anyone who did not answer questions and provide ID. So, to me, this is really a reflection of how militarized policing has become in many cities and towns across our country, where not only do they want to have AR-15s, but they want to carry them on routine patrol, and they felt quite comfortable announcing this at a town hall meeting. And celebrating this plan. So they were informed that their plan was plainly unconstitutional, and so they ended up not instituting the plan, but they kept the AR-15s. So I share that story just as an example of what I think we're dealing with, and the fact that they were only going to use them on patrol in certain neighborhoods is also telling about the issues that we've been discussing. So, I think it's safe to say that, as Nikichi said this morning, everybody wants to live in a neighborhood that's safe. We all want safety. And it's also safe to say that fairness is a value that resonates. The ACLU has done some research into this in terms of analyzing public opinion and what do we want our criminal justice system to do. And when you pick apart sort of what does a fair system look like, we get into some pretty challenging questions. But just on a certain level of generality, fairness is a value that resonates. And it seems to me that the culture of militarism and the way in which racial biases, both implicit and explicit, have infected the criminal justice system makes the system neither safe nor fair. So, as we've been talking about, the ACLU put out a report on the militarization of policing, and I have some suggestions for solutions that come from that report. And then I'd like to talk about maybe some broader solutions for addressing the system a little bit more generally. Specifically in terms of militarization, I think first of all, we've got to rein in the federal funding streams and grant programs that are fueling the militarization of state and local police. So I'm encouraged to report that the Obama administration is conducting an internal review of the DoD's 1033 program, the Justice Department's Byrne Justice Assistance Grant Program, and the DHS Homeland Security Grant Program, which combined have funneled billions of dollars worth of equipment and money to state and local law enforcement. So that internal review is going on now. And there are some bills that are pending in Congress that would put some constraints on the Defense Department 1033 program. One of the bills that's pending is limited to the 1033 program. There's another bill that would be a little bit broader. Who knows, what will happen with those bills this session in Congress. But it's encouraging that some attention is being brought to this issue on a federal level. On a statewide level, I mentioned this morning that the state of Utah last session passed a law that requires local law enforcement to report on their use of special weapons and tactics teams. I think this is a really positive development, and other states should absolutely follow suit. Transparency is almost totally lacking in this area, and we need a lot more of it. So I think transparency is an important first step in terms of statewide solutions. I also think, though, that state lawmakers need to go a step further and put some reasonable constraints on the ability of police to use paramilitary weapons and tactics. So we think that there should be a pretty high standard before the police should be able to deploy a paramilitary team to a person's home, and that standard should be that there's a likelihood of an imminent threat to life. If the police have a good reason to believe there's an imminent threat to life, then they ought to be able to use whatever tactics are available to save lives. However, if they're deploying a special weapons and tactics team to serve a warrant, we want to make sure that before they do that, they have explicitly demonstrated why they think it is that they need a special weapons and tactics team to deploy to go to a person's home to serve a search warrant on the person's home. We don't think that SWAT teams should ever be deployed based solely on probable cause to believe drugs are present. We've heard anecdotally that several cities have in place policies in which whenever they're going to serve a warrant, which is based on probable cause, they send a full SWAT team. They send an armored vehicle with a cadre of 10 or 15 officers heavily armed. They break down doors. We don't think that's appropriate. So the deployment of a SWAT team should never be based solely on probable cause to believe drugs are present. And again, if they're going to use a SWAT team to serve a warrant before deployment, they ought to be able to demonstrate that ordinary law enforcement officers aren't capable of serving that warrant. There should be some demonstration that use of a paramilitary team is actually necessary. We're also hoping at the state level, and this may be of particular interest to the defense bar, we would like for there to be rules in place that would require that once there's a standard for deploying a SWAT team to a home, if the police violate that standard, that any evidence that's obtained during the course of the warrant's service be suppressed at trial. We've never seen any state adopt that kind of rule. We don't know, we have no way of sort of anticipating what our likelihood of success is there. But we think that if states are going to have laws on the books that say that no SWAT team will be deployed unless this very high standard is demonstrated, if they're going to use a SWAT team and they find evidence, that evidence ought to be suppressed at any later criminal proceeding. We also think that there's a lot of room at the local level. As has already been stated, when a local police department wants money or equipment from the federal government, they go through what's called a state coordinator, and the state coordinator then goes to the feds, which completely circumvents the local community. We know of a few incidents in which local communities have held city hearings, city council hearings, when their police have wanted to obtain military equipment. There's one example from a small town in New Hampshire, which they held a city council hearing because they learned that the police department wanted to obtain an armored vehicle from the federal government. And a retired Marine who had served in Iraq testified at that hearing, and he said, "Do not turn my community into Fallujah." It was really powerful. So that kind of thing can matter, although I should say that the city went ahead and got its armored vehicle. But that kind of thing is powerful, and it should matter. And the voices of local communities need to be brought into the question of whether the police are going to arm themselves with weapons designed for combat. We also think that if states aren't able or willing to pass laws to put reasonable constraints on the use of SWAT teams, then local police departments should do it internally. Police departments already have, for the most part, some standards in place regarding SWAT deployments. Often we think that the standard is too low. We would like them to raise that bar. Again, we don't know the likelihood of that happening, but we think that that's an important step. We do think that body cameras would be an overall improvement in terms of increasing accountability, although we share many of the concerns that have already been expressed about implementation, in particular ensuring that there are appropriate safeguards in place so that the information and the video footage isn't misused in ways that undermine people's dignity and rights. So that's the summary of our recommendations, specifically on the issue of the militarization of police. But of course, as we've been discussing all day, the issues are much broader than that. And so I want to just say a few things about the system a little bit more broadly. First, we know the science is in, we can safely shrink the entire system. We know that it is possible to safely reduce our prison and jail populations in ways that will not increase public safety. We know that. The science backs us up on that. And we also know, particularly with regard to a question that was raised earlier, well, playing devil's advocate, wouldn't we think that by having these heavily militarized police departments and by having a really heavy criminal justice presence, that makes people safer? And it turns out that there's been some research done on this, that the neighborhoods in America that have the highest incarceration rates, in other words, the neighborhoods in America from which the vast majority of incarcerated people come, sometimes have higher crime rates. So that it turns out that once you reach a level of incarcerating people from your community, it actually has a tipping point that ends up increasing crime. So more criminal justice, more militarized police, more incarceration is not the answer. And we know we can do all of this safely. We also have to keep in mind that the solutions are not just about shrinking the prison population, and I say that because there's so much discussion today about shrinking the prison population, which is absolutely necessary, but we should be very careful not to do that at the expense of growing our jail, probation, and parole populations, because we don't want to simply shrink the prison system at the risk of having the entire system expand. Once you do that, you have increasing numbers of people on supervision, you have a lot more coercive control of particular communities. So what we really need to be thinking about is how to reduce the entire criminal justice system. And we worked recently with a filmmaking production company called Brave New Films that did a series called Overcriminalized, and I'd encourage people to look it up if they're interested. And this is about completely rethinking what we use the criminal justice system for. This is about saying we are not going to use the criminal justice system to deal with social problems like drugs, mental illness, and homelessness. That's just completely inappropriate. It's something we've been doing now for several decades, and we can walk it back. We can find alternative approaches to dealing with what are not inherently problems of crime. Drug addiction is not inherently a crime issue. It's a health issue. Mental illness, of course, is a health issue. Homelessness is a systemic social problem, and there's no legitimate reason to be employing criminal justice approaches to dealing with social problems. So we think we need to reduce the entire system and come up with more effective and fairer approaches to dealing with those kinds of social problems. Then, of course, we do have to shrink the prison and jail populations, and that requires law reform. And so we heard Nikichi this morning talking about we have to get rid of mandatory minimums. We have to shorten our sentences across the board. We have to decriminalize certain crimes that don't need to be criminalized. So we absolutely have to do all of those things. It's again important to understand that in the criminal justice system, there is racial disparity, unwarranted racial disparity, because controlling for everything else, we find race disparities at every stage of the criminal justice system, beginning with stops and ending with, sentences and reentry. At every stage of the criminal justice system, Black people are disproportionately likely to be subjected to unnecessary punitiveness, all other things being equal. And I think that We have to understand that some of this may be based on explicit bias, but a lot of it, as we heard this morning, is based on is because of implicit bias. And so I think implicit bias training has to be part of the solution. And I guess what I just want to conclude with is to say, I think that there's a tendency to think, there's a tendency on the part of the public to believe that when problems happen, it's the result of a few bad apples, and that if only we had better training, we wouldn't have this problem. And I think that that is a real mistake. And I think we've reached the point that we need systemic reforms. We need to rethink the purpose of the criminal justice system. We all want a system that's safe and fair, and our current system is neither.
Thank you, Kara. I think, I want to add that we've been mainly focused on African Americans, but we all know that this happens in communities of color, period, and I think the Muslim community would be the first to say this is happening to them at an increasing rate because of what's going on in the Middle East. And I just think it's not just us, African Americans, we see it across the board, and that's important that we're sensitive to all communities of color. With that said, again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I know Ron will want to get on this. But, we have this implicit bias, and we have this issue of imminent threat. And when you talk about imminent threat, we know that that has to be a subjective issue. There can't be an objective standard, because I think most police officers, and if there's any of them out there listening, they're rolling our eyes and saying, when you're in the moment, you have to do what you know you need to do. And so if Ron and I are in a community, and I'm a white police officer and I'm in a black community, and I know how the community feels about me, my subjective feeling about imminent threat is going to be based upon this implicit bias that's going to be different from Ron's. And how are we ever going to, have an agreement as to that? Because I'm going to react differently than he is because of his implicit bias and because of the color of his skin as a police officer, because the community is reacting differently to me.
So it turns out, when we did our report, we looked at a sample of 800 SWAT raids, which I should say is a tiny, tiny sliver of the number of SWAT raids that are conducted in this country every year. We looked at 800 of them, and what we found is that when the police deployed a SWAT team to respond to a situation in which there was a call out about an active shooter, a person who was at that moment putting others in danger, when they deployed in those situations, disparities dropped. So in those cases that we examined, the majority of the call-outs involved white people. Mm-hmm. So as far as I could tell just from reading the documents, and I don't have any of the context, I wasn't there, so I don't know what was going on in the minds of the people when they deployed. But at least from what we could tell from reading the documents, the call-outs were not that different for those scenarios. You'd often have a call, you'd have a person, often a father or a man who was under the influence of some kind of alcohol or drugs, who was threatening his family with firearms. That was the typical scenario. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a lot of variation in terms of whether the individual in question or the family in question was white, black, or any other race. So they would deploy, they would deal with the situation, and we're not objecting to that. The problem came when they were deploying for drug warrant service. And we found that when they deployed SWAT for drug warrant service, the race disparities increased. The point that you're getting to has to do with the determination of what constitutes quote unquote high risk. Because what many of them will say is they only deploy in the circumstances that I described. There's a person, an active shooter, they have a gun, they're under the influence. They deploy for those kinds of scenarios, and they deploy for high-risk warrant scenarios. But nobody says what high risk constitutes. And so I think the concern that you're getting at touches on when they get a call out, when they have a warrant, and they make a determination about the race of the people who are going to be in the house, depending on the address, that might affect their determination of whether it's a high-risk warrant. I don't know. I didn't see any evidence of that in the paperwork, but certainly it could. So that's why we're saying if you're going to deploy SWAT to serve a warrant in a house, explain why exactly you think it is that the scenario is high risk and provide some sort of corroboration to back that up.
Ron, any weigh in on that or that scenario?
You know, I had some experiences like that, and if I could tell it to you in story talk, I worked with in the 3rd District. I worked in B section, and we had probably, it might have been half and half in B section, half white, half black, and we had one Hispanic guy that worked in the wagon. And a lot of the white guys that worked with us had joined the police department, but they lived in places, honestly, between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh, you know, those rural communities. And some of them they had never ever seen a black person until they came to Washington, D.C. And at that particular time, the police force was only about 19 or 20% black, and the city was really probably almost 65-70% black. And the 3rd District, even though it was one of the most diverse districts in the city, these guys really didn't know black people. And so when we would go out, the times we worked together, or when I was walking a foot beat and they would ride in on a situation, those implicit biases would show up. And when I would bring it to their attention, they would say, and when I brought it to their attention, I would talk to them about how they were behaving, and they would also instantly say, well, you're different. And so I would say, well, why am I different? They said, because you're a police officer. So I said, no, I'm not a police officer, I'm a black man. I'm a black man. Well, again, they thought that being a police officer was different. Now, once they began to identify me with being an activist in the police department for and around black issues, then their implicit bias is also biased against me, because I shouldn't have been doing those things, because I was a police officer. It was interesting, and so, you know, we had a variety of trainings and things, and there of course there was nothing like what's going on today. The work that Tracy Curtis is doing from Denver, and then also Jennifer Bernhardt, who's at Stanford. And they're digging down deep into all of this stuff. And it really makes a difference in terms of how these guys, I can tell you that when I would work with guys, some of these guys, I would have it wasn't an opportunity, but by chance I would be working with them. And when we walked into a house, now this is another true story. We were in the 900 block of M Street, and this was in a 3-story house on M Street. And so a black man and a white woman were living together. We found out that they wasn't married. So, you know, the training was that, you know, when you walk in on a domestic violence situation, you part the people, right? So the white officer I was working with, he wanted the black man and went into the room and had a conversation with him. So, you know, I took the white woman and asking questions about what started the situation and all of that. So we came back together, and we're starting down the steps, we're leaving. And the black guy said something, and then the white police officer, he felt free enough to use the N-word with the gentleman and said, what did I say? And so I asked him while I was going to say, I said, what makes you think that you're free enough to use that word? He said, well, you know, I had a conversation with him, and I wasn't talking about you, Ron. I said, yes, you were. You were talking about me. What makes you think that I'm different? I'm an African-American man. And you use the N-word. So what is it? Well, I didn't mean to offend you, but I said, you did offend me. Well, it is something else. But they really, I don't know how you get to it because I don't think that I think when you bring all these people in, and I don't know if you can. I don't think you can train it out of them. What I think you can do is that once you get them to the place to identify what their biases are, and then work on educating them around how to manage those biases. But if they can't manage them, then you know what they need to do: find another job. Period. That's it. And so, yeah, we may have to go through all of those kind of things, hoops and whatnot, because government workers are hard to get rid of. But we need to get rid of those individuals because it's not going to change. I don't think you can change the way they see the kind of things that's happening because, and I know yesterday at the session, Tracy was asked the thing about black and Hispanics, and she told the truth. We've been talking about that for years. There are black and Hispanics who are worse than any of the white, insensitive whites I ever worked with. But they've been conditioned to see black folk in a negative way, and unfortunately, they see themselves that way. So I don't think you can't train it out of them even. If they can't manage it, then they shouldn't be police officers either. So bringing on more black police officers or even more women. I mean, sometimes women want the culture in the police department was for women that in order for you to stay around here, you have to prove you have to be a police officer. So what was the image of policing at that time? A white man. So you had to be aggressive, you had to be nasty, but women didn't bring that to police. And what women brought was a real sense of communication, ease, all those kind of things that men had never demonstrated. And when they used those assets, then they changed the dynamics of the situation. But we had some women who was tougher than men. And, and so I believe sometimes, you have to get rid of people. And it's not just, we serve two purposes. You demonstrate to that individual that that's inappropriate, and then you demonstrate to everybody else that this kind of inappropriate behavior is not going to be tolerated.
Right.
That's the reason we do it. And they need to do it then, and we need to do more of it.
Can I?
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question, Lamont. You wanted to follow, because I have a specific question.
It's real short. Ron, I'm different too. I'm getting that lately. I would think it goes by address on how they carry out a warrant. Because anytime I get pulled over and the officer is drawing his gun or has his hand on the gun, I can imagine what the protocol is when they come into my area to serve a warrant. So I'm thinking how to possibly way to help change the behavior is how you discipline the officers for the infractions. If every time an officer pulls over somebody, the record is showing that they're jacking the person up. If you discipline that officer where they're in jeopardy of losing their livelihood, then that behavior changed. Because I've lived in one of the most segregated places in the world is prison. So you have earned brotherhoods, you have black gangs, you have Hispanic gangs. Despite how they feel about each other, there is unwritten code on how we act around each other. You only see the aggressiveness when one group has a number advantage. But outside of that, we learn to get along with each other, because if there is a chance of some hostility to come across against the earned brotherhoods and the DC blacks, the DC blacks will take care of the issue to minimize it with the black guy, and the white guys will do the same. And so I think it's the form of how you discipline your officers when they cross a line that is against policy. That's how I see it.
Well, that's interesting because the job of discipline in the police structure is a sergeant and lieutenant, and sometimes they feel the same way the officer feels. So it may not be no discipline. It may just be, or raise another eyebrow, but that does nothing for the masses of individual behavior. They just excuse me, they just realized that you can't do it with them. That's all.
I have some questions that have come in, and one of the questions is, and I'm going to start with you, Lamont, is if you don't see the police as protectors, then who do you go to for protection in your communities?
Now, the fact that I'm not in nobody's way now, so when I come out of the house, it's job related, so I don't have a whole lot of interactions with others where I need the help of the police, but typically the police are not the people that I turn to help me address an issue. Now, I have called the police before. This was even in the crime days, right? It was some guys, it was some movement outside my place, and I thought they was about to do a home invasion, you know. I called the police. That's the one time ever that I called the police,
that's what
right?
They're supposed to do. That's their job, right?
Right, but they are not my go-to people when there's a situation. And most times, because when they come, when you call on the police, I don't care what color the officer is, white or black, it escalate into an area where you didn't want it to. And also, why I wouldn't call the police is because the Mr. Friendly now is who's selling drugs. It was a crime committed over here, so they trying to turn not only the communities but individuals that they arrest into informants, which leads to murders, and so they're not my first choice unless I'm trapped in a house and I don't really see no way out. I call them to come and save me or something.
I mean, we're laughing at that, Lamont. The bottom line is that we I think as a community and as a country and everything, we want to have good police. We want to believe in our police. We do need them at points in our lives. So how do we change that thinking around? What are you going to do?
I think what he was saying about the real community, not even police, I don't know, would you even call it community policing? But if I'm not just saying like all police officers are bad, because I know a whole lot of good police officers. It just, you have to put them in a community as like members of the community. I mean, like members of the community. They don't have to live in the community, but they have to interact to be a part of the community, whether it's coaching a basketball game or being part of a picnic. And what you were saying earlier about the hotspot is live and well, because I was a part of this organization. Brought in companies that they want to put on events during the summer. We call it part of the Safe Summer program, and they had all the hot spots listed, and that's where the police wanted everybody to go. So they are trying to do some things to better the community engagement, but only the best way to better how the community perceives you is you have to interact with the community in a way that you are a part of the community, not just you're trying to take our loved ones outside of the community, if that makes sense. So for me, that's how I think it'll better the relations, because we see police basically as bullies.
Yeah. So police wasn't, the invention of the police wasn't, in my opinion, wasn't designed to protect us in communities, because it was designed to provide public safety, but it was designed to provide public safety in a measured kind of way. And what I mean by that is that, for example, there in Washington, D.C., there are almost 700,000 people. We have less than 5,000 police, and that's for a reason. Because anymore, if the police equal the citizenry or more, then it's a police state. The burden of public safety in the community is also shared by the individuals who live in the community. And they had to step up and do that. And we can provide that level of protection and safety for each other. And we should. And there are communities in this country that are experimenting with projects like that. And where communities are employing things like what is it called? Where you, I don't know, that's a product of getting old. I can't think of it, but where they create their own criminal justice systems where they look out for the young people, and they even sending some of the youth to community action, restorative justice. Those are projects and programs that go to, in a large sense, remove the police actions from our community and get the community more involved in criminal justice. And the criminal justice system has only itself to blame for the reducing of their presence in certain communities, because communities and residents haven't been satisfied with the results of the criminal justice system when we look at it in a holistic sense. So in my community, the more we work together, the more we know each other, the more we participate in the kind of activities that's going on in the community, we're providing that level of protection for one another. Because in order for the police to do anything in our community, the first thing you had to do is what? Call them. And if I had to call the police because we don't see them enough to really, and I'm not being super critical, but we don't see them enough to say that when I turn around, I'm going to see him. So if Lamont is living next door to me, I want Lamont to know that he can come knock on my door, and if I can help him in any kind of way, I'm going to help him and anybody else on my block. And then when we talk about a public safety strategy for our block, then we need to get together as a community and talk about establishing norms and values for what's going to be tolerated in our community and what's not going to be tolerated, as what we're going to do with our youth. And people that have to be involved in that process. Now, what that does is that when we have a legitimate public safety issue, we can call the police and they can't give us an excuse, because we're not wearing them to death. They can't say they overloaded. They have to come and respond. But we're also going to do our job, because public safety really is about, it's really about a 60-40 thing. 40% citizens, 60% police. And as we work more on the preventive side, being proactive, we can reduce that down even more. And it ought to be a good thing, because we can do that ourselves in their communities.
Well, and it's investment, it sounds like. I mean, you're
Absolutely.
invested in your community. So the next thing I'm wondering, Lamont, is that, Cynthia Roseberry and the Clemency Project and all these lawyers that are working the ACLU and all of these lawyers working to get a lot of people released, should affect a lot of lives. Is there a plan in effect in terms of those reentering, not only trying to get themselves back into our communities, but a mentality about law enforcement? Because we know recidivism rate, I mean, you leave prison and there's a high percentage that you go right back within the year, because you can't, you don't have the ability to get it together. So I'm wondering, is there a plan there of how to deal with our police officers, our law enforcement? How do you do it?
Well, I don't know if there is a plan there, but I believe while the recidivism rate is so high, when you have individuals, use me as example. When I was going up for parole, my family, either I couldn't live on the property, or they didn't know was I gonna be that same Lamont Carey that I was when I left the street. So I didn't have a fixed address to use to come home to. So I had to use a friend's address. So it's a whole lot of barriers. I mean, we come home with institutional behavior. I had my first apartment, and after like 3 months of being in the apartment, I think it was, one of my buddies told me that I'm not living in a cell no more. And he was like, you can move some of the stuff out of the bedroom and use some of the other space in the house, right? So reentry employment is great. I mean, everybody that come home, if they can get a job, they need it. But life skills, how to communicate, the one thing that I felt when I came home from prison, I don't know where it came from, but I felt this thing before I went to prison. Before I went to prison, I knew I was going to prison because that was what happened in my community. And so that was fed to me by criminals, right? That didn't want to go to jail no more, so they had me selling drugs. They had me find the gun. So they pitched prison as a rites of passage to manhood. And even though I changed while I was in prison, when I came out of prison, I felt like my chest stuck out. Like I survived that. So it's like, even though I had thought I had got away from that street behavior mentality, I felt it. But because in prison I learned how to examine and check myself, I was able to move past that. So it's just so many things that prevents an individual from successfully transitioning. One, like I mentioned earlier, the relationship with their parole officer. Two, the biggest threat that I think that interferes with a person successfully transitioning is that all of these individuals in prison feel that they have to come home and take care of this family that has been taking care of themselves since they've been incarcerated. Even I said it. Somebody, which I barely had my phone calls accepted, but when my phone calls get accepted, they like, what you gonna do when you come home? I'm gonna work at any job. I'm lying like I don't know what, but I need that human contact. I need to, because I felt abandoned. I couldn't understand why did the people that I loved didn't love me back. So I took it upon myself to right all the wrongs that I must have done that I wasn't aware of. So I wanted to take care of my struggling family when I came home. How in the world am I going to take care of somebody when I haven't even got myself right? So what my belief is that most of the individuals abandon the plan that they had when they were in prison. The plan that they had when they were in that cell, I'm telling you, they have them. And so then they try to come home. They done told these stories like I did, and your family members looking at you like, I thought you said you was going to work at McDonald's. I thought you said you was going to go get a construction job. Lamont Carey is not going construction. Lamont Carey is not flipping burgers. So that's my truth, right? But I was so pressed for the human contact, to feel loved by my family members, that I said I was going to do that. So we create this need that we are the saviors of our community. And so when we come home and moms and our sisters and our kids looking at us on this couch and we can't find a job, they start to not be as appreciative to have us home like they were that first month. Now we're becoming a burden. When I first came home, you was giving me $50 a week. Now the month done passed, you got to do for yourself. And so we start to feel that sometimes invisible or verbal pressure of we need to do something fast. So some of us, we start hanging back out around that old crowd, start getting high. Now the drug addiction is back. Or we try to get out and sell drugs or whatever, rob something or whatever, to get us out of the living situation that we're in. So for me, what I think will help make people successfully transition from prison is transitional housing. That's longer than 6 months, like a year or 18 months for you to be able to take a trade where you can go into an apprenticeship program, or you can start experimenting with entrepreneurship. And so within a year, you should be able to have saved. So you got to teach budgeting. It's just like you got to teach you got to reintroduce us back into society, because while in prison is its own society. There are two rules in prison: the institutional rules and the convict rule. And most of the time, if you're doing one, you violating the other. So what I had to learn is how to navigate both of those societies within a society, and I had to carry that on to when I got released from prison. So we need how to communicate. how to actively do a job interview, so reentry starts before release. And so that's one of the things, like I started a nonprofit called Contact Visits. So that's like one of the things that I'm trying to do is get inside of prisons and begin to help them face reality. The other thing that I'm gonna shut up about prison is that I have never met, and all of you have represented them, nickel and dime, corner boy, street hustler. Everybody is a key dealer. And so in prison, if you're not being truthful with yourself, that I was a broke hustler, I wasn't successful as hustler, but everybody's a kingpin in prison. So all of your stories start to represent kingpin mentality. And so unless you honest with yourself inside that cell, you think when you come home, most of the individuals think when they come home, they coming home to a celebration. And that celebration is not a celebration, it's a rude awakening. So life, like a real introduction to the realities of what they really going to run into when they come home from society, I think is what's needed, but it needs to start not after prison, but in prison. So.
Thanks, Lamont. I know that the defense lawyers were all listening to this. You know, we don't ever get to hear the stories after our clients go away. So
right.
It's helpful to us in terms of our
and we be mad at y'all
representation.
too. We be mad at y'all too. Y'all don't be answering. Let us know more after we done got the conviction.
We now know that you're mad at us about that. But it's important. It's really important. So we have 5 minutes left here, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer this and it's not fair, as quickly as we can, but after what we've seen on television, Ferguson and the ongoing aftermath, and what we've heard with the police, how do we heal? What's your suggestion of, it doesn't have to be as a defense lawyer or ACLU rep or whatever. Where do you think we go from here, Kara?
You mean specifically about Ferguson?
It can be about Ferguson. It's a question we got from our audience, and I think it's not just Ferguson. Obviously, we're seeing it in a lot of places in terms of militarization, the police, and shootings, and the whole bit. So,
I mean, I guess you said I could speak personally, not as an ACLU person.
However you want
so I will do
to
that.
address it.
I think that we have to be really honest and clear about what's happening. And I'll just share a couple things. There were some polls that came out after Ferguson about, the number of white people who thought that race was involved. And I forget what that number was, but it was low. Right. I think, I don't know what that's about. I don't know if that's, if people really believe that, or if they're, if they're just saying that because they don't want to say that. I don't know. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is I read a piece in Daily Coast that I think I think folks should read, and it's called "Dear White People, Stop Being Surprised When the Police Kill Black People."
I saw that.
And it's basically saying that African Americans have been complaining about police abuse of black people for centuries. Why are you so surprised? Did you think we were lying? Did you think we were joking? It's insulting. Your surprise is insulting. And I thought that was a really well-written piece, and it really gets to some really painful and difficult stuff that I think we're just going to have to be able to address.
Thank you, Kara.
I agree, and I read it too. But my comments go to, I think this administration missed an opportunity. And the missed opportunity is that, for whatever reasons is that the president opted to have a beer party in the Rose Garden rather than a conversation about race and criminal justice in America. When Professor Gates was arrested and confronted and arrested on the porch of his house in Cambridge. What we should have had in this country and need very honestly is a conversation of race and criminal justice, because this has been going on too long. I have about 45 years of history in all of this, and less in front of me than behind me. And I would really like to see some significant substantive kind of resolutions to this issue. And unfortunately, I'm not feeling that way, because as much as I'm elated over the fact that we now see young people involved in this, and in Ferguson and other places in the country, I'm happy and elated about that. I'm not elated about the possibility of this officer being indicted in St. Louis County, because I haven't seen that. There's no sort of evidence that that has been a trend. They usually walk away. And if they do go to jail, like in the Oakland case, he spent a year in jail, I think, when that, in my opinion, was premeditated murder. So, as much as I want to be optimistic, my history tells me not to be so optimistic about what's going to ultimately come from this. But we need to talk more. We need to have conversations like this conversation that has taken place today. We need to talk more about it.
Thank you, Lamont.
I just think the talk more is cool. I believe since, like in Ferguson, because it's not new. This kid that was killed is not the first kid that was killed, and those that didn't know, those other communities that didn't know that this happened in our community, I'm glad that they're awake now, but we have to use that energy, how everyone is so engaged, and figure out how to move it forward, like through the ballot box, and put pressure on our local officials who allowed it to happen on their watch because of policies that they have in place that kind of created these kind of situations. So while we got these young people engaged, now we have to give them direction, because once the camera's gone, everybody going back to locking their doors again and living how they were living. So we have to figure out how to keep them engaged, how to use this as an empowerment movement versus just one incident just happened, let's go radical or what have you. We have to invest in our young people when we have their attention to guide them in the right direction, and talk through the ballot box. Race gonna always be an issue here. We can figure out later on how to ease that tension, but more important, we got to figure out how to keep Jamal and Mike from being gunned down in the street. And so that means we have to become protectives of our own community. So that's how I see it.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to our esteemed panel. I appreciate your time on this issue. I think it was an eye-opening discussion, and I'm optimistic that it will lead to further discussions, and ACDL is at the forefront of that. And most importantly, to everyone out there, go vote. It's a couple of weeks, go vote. Change the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ted Simon is going to give our closing remarks.
Thanks, Lisa. I also would like to thank all the viewers for watching Under Siege, and of course, a really big thank you to our staff for organizing it, and our panelists for participating in this timely and very important webinar. As well, you should note that the webinar will be available for viewing in a few days at www.nacdl.org/racial justice. That's www.nacdl.org/racial justice. And if you're not already a member of NACDL, please consider becoming a member and a larger part of the mission. The membership website is located at www.nacdl.org/join today. Once again, www.nacdl.org/join today. And you also may be interested in another upcoming seminar, NACDL's 16th annual Making the Case for Life, taking place next week, Mitigation in Capital Cases in Charlotte, North Carolina. Thank you, one. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.